Alright, to capture amazing video, you need to learn so much, and sometimes it can just take an agonizing amount of time. So in today's video, I'm going to be cramming a bunch of information right into your face and ears so it percolates into your brain and you can learn much faster than I had to. Hello, I am Leif from Anything Cameras, the channel that focuses on helping you improve your filming and photography. And in today's video, it's going to be about exposure for video, white balance for video, and color profiles for video. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't this the same as photo? No, it's much different, and here's why. Video and photo are different. There's the reason. Okay, let's get into this. So let's start out with the most basic information I am going to be giving you today, and that is exposure. Now you might already know the basic exposure triangle, but if not, let me give a quick rundown. You have three different ways to expose your image: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. ISO is basically how sensitive your your camera sensor is to light. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitive it is to light. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive it is to light. So now there are some disadvantages to just cranking up that ISO number when there is a low light situation, and that is the higher the ISO number, the more grainy your image is going to be. Okay, now let's move on to aperture, and that is, well, the aperture in your lens, and the wider the aperture, the lower the aperture number is going to be, and the brighter the image is going to be. Because more light is hitting the image sensor. The smaller the aperture is, the larger the aperture number will be, and the less light will hit your image sensor, which makes a darker image. A little bit confusing, but just remember, bigger number, darker image, smaller number, lighter image. Now, let's move on to shutter speed, and this one is important to remember, especially for video. Alright, shutter speed is important for video because we need to get the correct amount of motion blur in a video. Now, you might be thinking, why do we want motion blur in a video? Wouldn't that look bad? Well, no, because the human eye captures motion blur naturally. We see stuff blurry when it moves around really fast. It's just unavoidable. It looks natural to us, though. So, to capture the right amount of motion blur for the camera, we need to make sure our shutter speed is correct. You might think that, well, for fast subjects, you want a higher shutter speed, and for slow, maybe still subjects, have a slower shutter speed. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It's not like photo where that applies. It's a little bit different. So the faster the object, the more blur you want to see. The slower the object, the less blur you want to see. Therefore, you want a consistent shutter speed, unless you're going for some effect, which some directors like to do. It's just personal preference. But to make your video generally look good, you want what's called a 180-degree shutter angle. Now, before I confuse you, I'll explain this. Old film cameras had a circular shutter, and they could open it up wider, and 180 degrees meant half a circle was passing in front of the film, which meant that basically if your image was, if you're taking one photo every second, the exposure would be, the shutter speed would be 1/2 of a second. So if you're filming at 24 FPS, you want your shutter speed to be at 1/48 of a second. Now that's just double the frames per second. So as long as the shutter speed number is double the frames per second, you will get the correct amount of motion blur. So if you're filming at, say, 30 FPS, you want a shutter speed of 1/60th. Now, I am hearing the complaints already. My camera doesn't have a 1/48th of a second shutter speed. Yeah, calm down, who cares? Shoot at 1/50th of a second. It's close enough. It's still going to look natural. This camera right here happens to have 1/48th of a second, which is quite handy, but not many do. It's kind of an unusual thing, especially in the photography camera realm. So, now that we've cleared up shutter speed a little bit, let's move on to white balance. Now, white balance is interesting because in photography you want to have it on auto, but in video you definitely don't want to have it on auto. So here's the reason. For photography, you're shooting, you're changing lighting, but you generally always want a correct white balance in your image. So it'll auto-correct it for you. Now with video, you might strive for a correct white balance, but if you're changing lighting situations, say you're vlogging, and you're going from a nice sunny daylight scenario to a dingy bar somewhere, and the lights are all yellowy and nasty looking. Well, if you have it auto switch to correct the white balance, it'll look kind of odd. It'll be jerky and nasty looking, so you don't want to have it on auto white balance. Also, another scenario is you want to get a moody lighting in some video in a movie you're filming. And say if you want it nice and blue, you don't want the auto white balance to switch it to daylight white balance so it looks like daylight there. Before I go any further, what is white balance? Well, it's just how your camera interprets the whites in the image. If it's a very blue image, it's gonna be interpreting the whites bluer. If it's a orangey image, it's gonna mean that the whites are being interpreted orange. So white balance is measured on the Kelvin scale. This is color temperature. Now the color temperature is just how warm or cold your image is. So cold is blue, warm is orange. Now if you're enjoying all this information being thrown at you at a supersonic speed, please consider subscribing for more videos like this. So on this Kelvin scale, 5600 Kelvin is daylight and 3200 Kelvin is tungsten. You know those old tungsten bulbs that might be hanging around your grandparents' house? Yeah, those. So in between there are tons of different white balances, and on either side you can get warmer than tungsten and colder than daylight. So just make sure you play around, find the white balance that works for you. There are some presets in there that are kind of handy in most cameras, but I like to just go through the Kelvin scale if your camera has that capability. Okay, so now we know why we shouldn't use auto white balance and what white balance is to begin with. Let's move on to color profiles. Now a color profile is basically a preset where your camera says, okay, red should look like this, green should look like this, blues should look like this. You know, it figures out what the colors should look like, how saturated they are, how contrasted they are, how sharpened the image is, and what the tint of the image is, so whether it's a purple tint or a green tint. So let's break this down a little bit. If you use a standard color profile in your camera, most have what's called actually standard. That's what the camera manufacturer considers real. Now, every single camera manufacturer has a different standard and they all look different. Now, you might be wondering, hang on, aren't you filming with a Fujifilm here and a Canon here, and how do they look the same? Well, we'll get into that in just a minute. Let me explain a little bit more. So, you can change the color profile. Sometimes you'll see like vivid or some film simulation, depending on the camera you have, and those will just change those parameters I was talking about. So they could change the saturation of certain colors or the contrast. So that's what a color profile is. Now you can also use a special color profile called log. Now it's on Canons it's called C-log, on Fuji's it's called F-log, and on I think Sony's it's S-log. And there are all sorts of other log footage names, but it all has log in the name. And what do you know? Nikon's is N-log. Huge news, if you couldn't already figure that one out. Now, not all cameras shoot log. For example, the Canon 80D that's right in front of my face right there does not shoot log, which technically you can get around. I'll talk about that in just a second. So log footage is a color profile that is very bland looking, as you can see right here. It's flat, no contrast, basically no saturation, very little tint. It's kind of disgusting looking. Well, because you can capture much more dynamic range. So you can see the sky perfectly exposed and the ground, which can be hard to expose correctly in an image. So F-log does help with that. Okay. So with F-log, there's also another capability. You can color grade it very well. Color grading is where you go into your editor and adjust the colors and adjust the saturation and the the contrast. So that way I can match this camera with this camera. So I can take the log footage and match it with the Canon footage. So now, as I said, you can kind of get around log footage with a camera that doesn't have log. It's not perfect, but let me explain how you do this. You go to your custom color profile, and you just drop basically all of the parameters to 0. Sharpness, 0. Contrast, 0. Saturation, 0. Just drop it all down to 0, and you'll get the flattest, least saturated color with the least amount of tint to it one way or another, which will allow you to then go back in the editor and edit it to look like other footages. So we are actually filming on this Canon 80D with that custom color profile where it's all at 0, so we can make the matching process easier with this Fujifilm. So all we have to do is edit the colors and bingo, they look the same. It does take a bit of time and is hard on the computer, but once you learn how to do it, it's pretty easy, which is a topic for another video. So yes, that's about it. That's filming. Let's sync this audio. Let's sync this audio. All right.
Percolate's a word.
It is.
I'm looking this up. Okay, continue.
If that's not a word, shred me apart in the comments. I don't care. All right. All right, I just need to roll up my sleeves to get ready for this intense moment I'm about to have. Okay. There'd be so many bloopers.